Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the consulting version of the MBA Career Services Insider Webinar Series. So thank you very much for joining us today. Before we begin, let me just mention a couple of bits of housekeeping. So the first thing is, if you could please mute your microphone, that would be wonderful. And the second point is, this will be an entirely audio conference, so there's no need to have your camera on, so please disable that. So today I want to talk about 4 different things, and then if we have time at the end, we'll go into a little bit of Q&A. I'm going to just start by introducing myself very briefly, and then I'll talk about what strategy consulting is. I'll go into a bit about how we recruit students into strategy consulting at IESE, and then what we do to prepare students for that process. And then if we have time at the end, we'll do a bit of Q&A. So let me start by introducing myself. So I'm Fawson. I'm an Associate Director from MBA Career Services here. So I'm entirely focused on the consulting sector. My background, I'm British. I'm an economist. I was working in London in consulting with EY, and then I worked in finance for a hotel company, which is IHG. And then I actually studied the MBA here, so I graduated in 2016, so just over 2 years ago. And after my MBA, I moved to Deloitte. So I worked as a strategy consulting manager in Amsterdam, and I was both working as a consultant and also as a recruiter there. I've been working now at IESE for about 1 year, so I decided to come back and work for the school. And then a little bit of sort of pictures of me on the slide here. I thought I'd drop in. So a picture from the MBA, a picture of me cycling, and then lastly a picture of our team. So this is a picture of the career services team on the right-hand side. So what is strategy consulting? And I think the first sort of point to make is that the word consultant is used very frequently, and many people are consultants. It's a very general term. But strategy consulting is a particular type of consulting. And I mean, it is a specialism in business strategy. And what happens is strategy consultants, they work with very senior people within companies to help them craft and often execute their strategies. A hallmark of a strategy consultant is somebody who works with C-level. In terms of just a little bit more operationally what that means, the way that I think about this, there are 2 dimensions. So on the one hand, strategy consultants, they work across many different sectors. So you have some firms that are very large and very general, which have, well, sector practices. So these can range from consumer goods or financial services through almost anything you can imagine. And then you have firms which are more narrowly focused on one particular sector. So, I mean, these are often smaller boutique firms. And then the other dimension I think about is, well, what are these firms actually doing? So what kind of projects do they work with their clients on? And there's really a range of different issues. So they all relate to strategy points. And they're all projects which involve C-level decision making. So very sort of typically corporate and business user strategy was sort of old strategy consulting, and then it's moving more in a direction of innovation consulting, which is longer term thinking, digital consulting as companies change. And it's really a pretty wide variety of projects that people do. And I think that when you think about those 2 dimensions, so the sector dimension and the project dimension, I think that something that appeals to lots of MBA students and prospective MBA students is that diversity. So people like the fact that they're doing or potentially doing lots of different things. How does a project work? So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about very, very high level what a strategy consultant is, and then the kinds of projects they do on sort of the 2 main dimensions, very, very high level. But in terms of how a project actually works, I think that there are 4 main stages. So you start with some sort of request or some sort of lead, which leads to a proposal. So this is where a team puts together basically a project plan for a potential client. So this means figuring out what the problem is, figuring out an approach to solve that problem. And then you'd probably be surprised at how much depth they would go into regarding teaming, pricing, even, let's say, a Gantt chart of what they're going to do. And that's all laid out in a bid, which is delivered to the potential client, and then the client in the end would choose one consultant to work with. Then once that decision's been made, there's a kickoff, which is another meeting with the client, typically with a wider pool of people from the client and the whole project team. And this is where any of the discussion points from the proposal are reviewed. This is where a more concrete project plan is put in place, and then basically the client and the consultant agree how the project will unfold. And then the project actually physically happens. So this is where the consultants really go and do their work. The type of work that you do as an MBA I'll go into on the next slide, but a sort of very high level basis, what does a strategy consultant do? They gather information, they analyze it, and then they present it back to the client. So this involves collecting data from the client, collecting data from outside, from research. It involves speaking with lots of people. So this includes the client and the client's customers and potentially experts, many different people. And then there are often a series of meetings and workshops to work through what can be quite a sort of complex problem and complex data sets. There's obviously a lot of internal stuff, internal organization and analysis and building frameworks, etc., that happens during the project. And then during the project, there are milestones, which are called steering committee meetings. So this is when the key stakeholders from the clients get together with the consulting team, and they work through every 2 to 3 weeks the status of the project, and the consultant essentially updates the client. They tend to be very content focused, so they go through the findings so far and what that means for the solution to the overall problem. And then right at the end of the project, you have what would be a final steering committee meeting, which is when the consultant presents its final conclusions and recommendations. And then after that stage, there's often some communication just to finish the project, but it's largely done at that point. And then I sort of alluded to your role. So as an MBA joiner, you're really sort of a key person on the team. So typically what you do with a strategy consulting project is you have a big problem, and in order to make it sort of manageable and solvable, you divide it up into chunks. And then as an MBA, you basically look after one of those chunks. So your job is to solve that chunk and also to prepare the presentation for the client. So if you start with the solving first, you collect information from the client, you research often online, you research often about the client's business, its industry, its competitors, etc. Number two, you go through a lot of interviews, you speak with the client, its customers, you can speak with competitors, and you can speak with specialists too. As you sort of work through your chunk, you're often going to be with the client. It's very, very typical that when you do a project like this, if it's high profile, etc., which normally it is, you're basically working hand in hand with the client team. So the client would often dedicate a few people to work with you, and they help you, manage the timeline from their side. They help you look into the organization, and they provide information and support and process. Once you've sort of gathered information and you've worked through those conversations, comes the analysis. So this is often very quantitative, and often you're looking for patterns and insights that solve the chunk of the problem which you're looking after. And then when you find your insights, which, by the way, this is an iterative process, so you often have to go back to collect more information or to go and do more interviews or have more discussions, you would go to your team and you would evaluate what you found. You would test or basically review the hypotheses that you came up with earlier in the project. Those hypotheses can be come up with as early as the proposal or even before the proposal, by the way, and then you define next steps. So the team actually helps define what comes next. And I mean, if you imagine that you're in a team meeting you have yourself with your own piece of the pie, but also you're working with other consultants and other managers, etc., who have an overall view of the project, and then that creates an iteration again. The way that strategy consulting is, well, let's backtrack actually. So if you have a typical strategy consulting project, which might be, let's say, €500,000, what is actually the client buying for that money? And I mean, basically they're buying three things. One is they're buying your time during the project. So it can be a month, 3 months, etc. project where you're there physically on site, and you're an advisor during that time. Then they're buying your presentations, and particularly the final presentation with your recommendations. And the third thing they're buying is a deck. So basically a deck of slides very, very frequently. And so, I mean, that last thing is the concrete thing which survives after the project. And it is the most important document which you're working through all the way whilst you're on the project. So, I mean, from day one, you're building slides and you're populating slides with your findings. And it's a very hypothesis-driven discussion. So often before you start your analysis, you already have the answer in your head, and you're going out to prove that answer. And then imagine that the less fun side, I think, of being a strategy consultant is that you have to spend a lot of time on PowerPoint, fine-tuning the slides, making them very, very client-friendly and making them very clear. And then your sort of work stream, your chunk, fits into the wider deck, so everything has to sort of logically make sense. And then hopefully at the end you come up with a recommendation which solves the problem. And then in the final deliverable, so you have your final document, which is the thing which survives after you leave, and then the presentation. And I mean, I think from project to project, from firm to firm, etc., your involvement in that presentation will vary. So sometimes you will be there, sometimes you won't. So I mean, that's also something I think which people really appreciate about joining the sector, is that you basically get to sort of present quite important and quite, I would say, complicated solutions to problems to quite senior people from the client side, and that's a good exercise of learning. And I think I've sort of, through that very, very brief brain dump on what strategy consulting is, alluded to some of the good things about the sector. So I have not included the other side. There are also many things that people don't like about strategy consultants. But if we go through these one by one, just sort of largely repeat what I said and maybe introduce a few new things as well. So number one, exposure. So you're working with top people. So strategy consulting is working with C-level people from often large businesses, because those are the ones that can afford strategy consultants. The second is impact. So, I mean, for somebody to have paid all of this money to hire you, typically the project is important, and you can often end up on things which are newsworthy, which can be fun. Networks. So this is really about how strong the networks of the strategy consultancies are. So, I mean, if you're thinking about doing an MBA, surely one aspect of that is becoming part of a business school network. And I mean, I think that it's sort of same again when you join a strategy consultancy. So, you have, depending on the size of the firm, many people working within this sort of industry who then fan out. And then, I mean, they're very good at keeping their alumni pretty close. So you actually have access to a lot of different people, often in very important positions. Fourth thing I wrote was people. So, I mean, it is an extremely sort of tough sector to break into, which we'll go into in a few minutes. And what it means, I think, is that you have often slightly weird, slightly wonderful people working, but I mean, people are pretty bright and hardworking, and it's a good environment to come in and learn from people. So if your objective here is to learn, it's basically you're learning from people, and it's a very, very sort of good opportunity in that sense. Puzzles is the next thing I wrote down. So I think that if you're somebody that likes solving puzzles of any kind, really, not just related to business or strategy, that is essentially what you're doing. So often you're hired to solve some sort of puzzle that the client has. These are very complicated things. And I mean, if you're an engineer, for example, and you're used to there being an answer to a question, one right answer, that's not how this works. So there is not one answer, and the puzzle is very, very complicated and very difficult to solve. The next thing I wrote is remuneration. So I think especially as an MBA, I think it's one of the sort of sectors which comes out quite well on the pay curve. Responsibility, so sort of works both ways. So you have a lot of pressure, but you do get given a lot of responsibility early on. So I mean, initially you're more sort of looking after your own chunk, and often you're shadowing somebody who's got more experience than you. But actually quite quickly you would transition into something where you're basically more held responsible and often in a leadership position. So, you know, especially if you're an MBA joiner and you're going in, you're working ahead of people who have 2, 3, 4 years experience doing something that you don't know about, you know, you're actually potentially trying to use your leadership experience and your experience working in, you know, things before an MBA to add value on that project. The penultimate point I made is travel. So if you like traveling, if you like moving around and you like basically not working in the same place every day, this is a great place to be, because you're basically changing projects and changing clients very frequently. And I mean, I think that consultancies are pretty good about letting you go around the world for client work. I mean, again, these are multinational companies, and also transferring to different offices or doing secondments or doing projects elsewhere. Because I mean, again, these are themselves, these consultancies are very international businesses. And the last point I think is variety. So if you remember my matrix from 3 or 4 slides ago, I mean, you're working across many, many different industries and many different project settings, depending on exactly where you go. And I mean, that variety can be very challenging, it can be very interesting, and it can help you figure out, I think, exactly, you know, what you really like within the grid. So let's sort of a long introduction about what strategy consulting is, or what I think it is, and let's go into more about recruiting. So the first question I think to ask yourself is, well, what do these strategy consultancies look for? And I mean, there are a number of different criteria. You can argue, I think there are 10 on here, more or less 10, which I think are the ones which I most frequently discuss with people, both on the recruiting and the student side. And you can argue for different firms and different types of consultancy where the importance lies on each of these. Some of these are fixed, so you can't change your academics, that is what it is. Some of them you can build a capability, for example, you know, let's talk about your problem-solving capability that can be built on. Some things are, let's say, hard skills like problem-solving. Some things are soft skills like being a strong communicator. So there are lots of different dimensions. And people that do well in the sector do well, I think, on most of these dimensions. And people that aren't good on one or more of these dimensions, they typically struggle at some point during their career in strategy consulting. And so it follows that this is not a secret, and this is what the consultancies look for when they hire. I would make a strong argument that as an MBA, you know, if you remember the slide a few slides ago where we talked about what you do as an MBA, it's very high on the analytical side. And that analytical problem-solving skill is the thing which is really strongly tested in the interview. I think it's the most tested of these things. So that's the thing to really focus on if you wanted to pick one. I mean, at IESE, we work with a number of different consultancies. This is just a subset. So what I've included on this slide is 12 companies that came to our career forum back in October 2017, so just under a year ago. So every year we hold a big conference where we invite employers from consultancy and from investment banking and from many different sectors within industry. And these were the 12 consultancies that came to our forum. And these are companies that presented themselves, that networked with students, that then held interviews to hire students. And I think that these are all large firms. There's one or two in this list which probably you know, depending on your previous sort of knowledge or experience, and there's probably one or two that you don't. I think the majority of these firms are big, and they do everything. So they do every imaginable industry, every imaginable project you can imagine within the strategy sphere. And I mean, these are sort of the ones that I would say scoop up most of our MBAs. So sort of I would say 80% of our MBAs would go into one of these companies, would be my guess. But then as well as these 12, we have many, many others that we work with. So typically these companies, they focus on a narrower set of industries or types of projects, or perhaps even geography. So if working for one of these big companies is not your bag, that's fine. There are many, many other opportunities. I mean, there must be thousands upon thousands of different consultancies, and the MBA skill sets, if you've got what we showed on the last slide, then there's absolutely every possibility of going to working for any of those. The IESE MBA is a 2-year program, and of those firms on the previous page, the overwhelming majority hire as summer intern. So this is somebody between their first and second year of the MBA who's looking to go and try something or go and get experience, or to basically prepare for the job after they graduate. And I mean, the fact that the program is a 2-year MBA is an enormous selling point. And those consultancies, they love the fact that they can hire people and basically try them in the business for 2 to 3 months. And vice versa, the students can go and experience. They're not going to go sort of all in after graduation without having a clear idea of what this is all about, really, because it can be different from what people expect. So the summer internship is, I would say, a major recruiting channel for us and for the consultancies. It is not the only one, so there is a direct full-time mechanism. But I wanted to just show you the numbers that we have. So I think on this chart, this is the number of students. So there are many students that receive many offers. So this is number of students. And these are the ones that go to those previous 12 firms. So they're, again, listed on the slide, but it was the same 12 firms that were shown on the graphic previously. And I think that there are basically 2 points I want to make. The first point is what we're seeing is a significant increase in interest on both sides, so both between consultancies and students, which I think drives up the number. So from 4 years ago, 21 students to 57 students in the most recent class. And the second is just to take stock of the quantity. So, I mean, our MBA is approximately 350 students in each class, and a number of those students come to the MBA with sponsorship from a company, or they come with a very specific idea of what they want to do outside of all of this world. And so I think for us to have 57 students, which is more than a seventh of the class, going into the sector for a summer, I think is very, very good. So all 57 are switchers, so none of them have done consulting before. So I mean, again, if you're somebody that has a different background but wants to break into this sector, then I mean, this is a great program to do so, as is evidenced by these numbers. And if we talk about how that pans out geographically, in our MBA we have people coming from, I think, 50 to 60 countries. So it follows that the recruiting model is very local. So consulting companies, they want people who understand the local culture, They want people who have authorization to move freely within those countries. They want people who speak the local languages very strongly. So it tends to be a local recruiting model. So companies, a big company like any of the ones that we list there would come and they bring many offices, and offices would try to meet students from those countries. And so it means that the students, they fan out often back to those regions or those countries. And if you look at where people tend to be more concentrated, so we have a lot of students from Latin America studying the MBA. We have a lot of students from North America in the MBA. If you look further to the east, we have lots of Japanese students, lots of Chinese students, so those are big hubs. But I think within Europe, well, let's say EMEA, we have 3 hubs which disproportionately take students. So we have Spain, of course. We have the UK, which is a big open, I'm biased, of course, a big open, accessible market. And then we have Dubai. So if you're eagle-eyed and have a good grasp of geography, you can see that Dubai is there in red, sort of in the middle of the graph. All right, so let's talk about how we do it. So how do we get 57 students into those 12 firms? It is a very, very competitive process, and it takes a lot of time and engagement. This really isn't the time to show up to an interview without having done a lot of preparation. This is CV, this is cover letter, this is networking, this is interview preparation, both in terms of the technical stuff which they test you on, and also in terms of your storyline. So we have 6 months of preparation. So, as soon as you join the MBA, we start preparing. And it's pretty intense. So on top of all of your classwork and all of your commitments, we ask a lot of time and energy in return. And the first thing to talk about on this slide, we have the consulting club. So we have 27 students from the 2nd year, the majority of whom are doing their internships in consulting, some of whom are sponsored, who basically run an organization which helps profess students. And you can see number 2 is a picture of one of the sessions that we ran about a year ago. So there's the president of the club standing up on the stage, and then a group of students who are starting their journey to understanding what the sector's about, and also preparing already for the process. The 3rd picture is a session which is run by a guy called Nicolas Constantinesco, who's previously a McKinsey recruiter and consultant, and is our professional coach. So he runs 5 sessions in the first term to train students specifically for the case interview. And you can see this is a session that we had on a Saturday back in September. I think it was our first session of last year. And again, a room full of students who are keen to learn about the case interview. And then the last thing I want to sort of mention on this slide is, I would say, more applied and practical skills. So, we're not talking about the MBA itself, which is a wonderful preparation for this kind of career, which is discussed totally separately from all this. But here we're talking about a case competition, and this is something that happens very frequently in an MBA in many different settings. So consulting and many other different sectors have case competitions running. And we actually organize one every year with Roland Berger, where we invite teams from different business schools around the world to come and join and compete for an internship. Actually, is the prize. And this is a picture of us standing on our terrace with the sea in the background from last year. And we had I think I'm there in the middle. Maybe top marks if you can pick up which one I am. We had a wonderful session. It was with it was a case about Nokia, and how Nokia has basically been through a lot of very difficult times over the last 10 to 15 years, and what it's planning to do next. And we were very, very lucky that we had the chairman of Nokia come to the campus to be the judge of who was going to win the competition, and also to give a very, very good perspective on what he thinks their struggles are, and what he wasn't sort of over disclosing what he can't tell the market, but what they're going to do next. It was a wonderful event. The second thing we do is more on the sort of, let's say, the recruiter side. So, I talked at length about the career forum. Pictures 1 and 2 are from that forum. So this is where we invite those 12 companies, but also companies from many, many different sectors to come to the campus. And they're selling themselves, basically. So they're introducing themselves, they're talking about how great they are, they're meeting students, etc. So this is basically your introduction to them. And then 3 and 4, we have regionally specific fairs as well. So we have a fair for Latin America and a fair for Asia. And in those 2 fairs, they're run in partnership with other business schools, just for economies of scale. And this is basically where students either from those regions or who are interested in those regions would go and meet those companies who are either focused on those regions or the offices of those companies that are very, very hungry and recruiting MBAs from the European business schools. And then lastly, I want to talk about treks. So we've talked about companies coming to us, but we also go to companies. So here are some pictures of us going to see companies in London. So that's a picture of us, again, oh no, not in that picture actually. That's us at BCG in London. Number 2, this is a trek to Dubai. It looks to me like they're in a shopping mall rather than an office. Number 3 is in Singapore. So this is a presentation, I'm not sure exactly what company that is, in Singapore. And number 4 is a picture of beautiful Madrid, the beautiful Madrid skyline. So we're actually organizing a trek to Madrid in November for the first time. And basically what a trek is it's a group of students, normally 20, 30, 40 maybe, who jump on a train or a plane and go to visit a city and go and visit companies in their offices. And those companies, they host presentations and games and networking events. And it's basically a more, I would say, vivid way of understanding what work and life would be like in those companies, because you're physically there. So it's a sort of critical bit of recruiting into the sector. All right, and with that, I think I'm pretty much done, and I think we might be out of time actually in terms of Q&A, unfortunately. Sorry about that. Before I close, let me talk about the other, let's say, insider series that we've got. So I am the 3rd. We've got the technology one coming up in a couple of weeks. All of these are going to be available on the IESE website, so you can actually go and listen to them afterwards. So no worries if you've missed them, and actually go and learn about many different sectors. So as I close, I think that hopefully this has been a sort of an interesting and informative webinar, and I would be absolutely delighted to hear any feedback about it, but also if you have any specific questions to yourself and you'd like to have a chat, that would be absolutely wonderful. So you can email me anytime. So my email address is wfawson@iese.edu. And yeah, I wish you all the best of luck. Yeah, so hopefully see you soon at IESE, and best of luck with your journeys. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.